I am not going anywhere, sir.
The cavalry post at Fort Hancock was a place where rules mattered more than souls. Colonel Marcus Whitmore ran it like a machine. Every soldier accounted for, every Apache counted and cataloged like inventory. Captain Thomas Ashford had served under him for 6 years, long enough to understand the difference between orders and morality, though he'd learned to keep that distinction to himself. The prisoner arrived on a Tuesday, bound in iron chains that seemed excessive even by military standards. Her name, they said, was Aiyana. She was Apache Chiricahua, specifically captured during a raid 3 weeks prior. She'd been kept in the detention block, a small adobe building with no windows and bars that sweated in the desert heat. The official charge was harboring fugitives. The real crime, Tom suspected, was being born Apache in a land that had decided Apaches shouldn't exist anymore. He'd seen her once when he brought food to the detention block. She sat in the corner of her cell, dignified despite everything. Her hair was long and black as obsidian. Her eyes held something that wasn't anger or fear. Something older, something that suggested she'd survived things worse than imprisonment. She wore traditional dress, tattered now, but worn with a grace that made the fort's crude wooden furniture look like it belonged in her presence. Not the other way around. Tom was assigned guard duty that week. It was the worst assignment at the fort. 12 hours in the sun or 12 hours in darkness, depending on shift. But for Tom, it was an opportunity to observe, to think, to come to terms with the fact that everything he believed about duty and honor was slowly being ground to dust by watching good men follow bad orders. On the third night of his guard duty, he learned why Aiyana had been captured. A soldier, drunk on whiskey and stupidity, boasted about it while Tom stood watch outside the barracks. She was protecting them. The soldier slurred. Her own people, a family, old man, woman, 2 children, hiding in the mountains. We would have found them anyway, but she wouldn't say where. Tough as iron, that one. Took 6 men to bring her in. Tom felt something cold settle in his chest. They hadn't captured a criminal. They'd captured someone who'd chosen loyalty over survival. They'd captured honor, and they'd locked it in a cell. The next morning, he learned they were transferring her. The paperwork came through official channels. She was to be moved to San Carlos, a reservation miles away, where conditions were known to be brutal. It was essentially a death sentence, drawn out over years instead of delivered quickly. The transfer was set for dawn. Tom lay awake most of the night. He thought about his family back east, about his mother who'd raised him to believe in justice. He thought about the oath he'd taken, and what that oath really meant. He thought about Aiyana, sitting alone in her cell, knowing what San Carlos meant. At 2 a.m, he made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He had access to the keys. He knew the guard rotations. He knew that between 2 and 3 a.m., there was a window of exactly 8 minutes when no one would be watching the detention block. He'd studied these patterns without knowing why, some part of his mind preparing for this moment long, before he'd consciously acknowledged it. The locks opened quietly. Aiyana was awake, alert, as if she'd been waiting. She didn't ask questions. She simply stood and moved toward the door with the liquid grace of someone who'd been ready to run since the moment they captured her. "The horses are 3 miles south," Tom whispered. "Follow the creek bed. Move only at night. By the time they realize you're gone, you'll be far enough." She paused and looked at him directly for the first time. Her eyes were the color of storm clouds, and they held the weight of understanding everything that was about to happen to his life. "Come with me," she said. Her accent was slight, her English careful. Tom's hand was on the gate. He could still go back. Report that she'd escaped. Maintain some thin fiction of innocence. "I can't." "You can. You did this. Now you run or you hang. There is no middle." He knew she was right. There was no middle. But he was a soldier. He had commitments, rank, a career he'd built over years. And yet, even as those thoughts formed, he knew they were lies. The career was over. The moment he'd opened that cell, he'd destroyed the life he'd carefully constructed. "All right," he said. "Give me 10 minutes." He moved through the fort with a clarity that surprised him. He packed a small bag, Nothing that would be noticed as missing immediately. He wrote a letter of resignation, vague enough to raise questions, but not so vague as to seem insincere. Then he walked out into the desert like a man taking a casual stroll and didn't look back. Aiyana was waiting with the horses. She'd moved faster than he'd expected, gathered supplies from somewhere. As they rode south into the darkness, Tom realized he'd never felt more free or more terrified in his life. They rode through the night and into the next day, pushing the horses hard, but not so hard as to leave obvious tracks. By evening, they'd reached a canyon Tom vaguely remembered from a patrol. Aiyana seemed to know it well. She guided them into a hidden camp. Nothing permanent, but sheltered with water. "We'll stay here," she said. "One night, rest. Tomorrow we move again." They sat around a small fire that she extinguished the coals to hide the light. Aiyana prepared food, dried meat, something with roots that tasted better than anything Tom had eaten in the fort. They didn't speak much. There was nothing much to say. Tom had destroyed his life. Aiyana had just begun hers again. But as the night deepened, something shifted between them. Tom found himself telling her about his childhood, about his mother, about the moment he'd realized that being a soldier meant compromising every principle he'd been raised with. Aiyana listened with the full attention of someone who understood that words were precious, to be honored. "My people have a saying," she said finally. "There is no honor in following a chief who leads you into darkness. The honor is in having the courage to walk away. My chief is the President of the United States." Tom said bitterly. "Then that is even more reason to leave. The farther you are from that darkness, the better." As the fire burned to nothing, she moved closer to him. They didn't touch it first, just sat near enough that Tom could feel her warmth. Then her hand found his, and she held it like she was holding something that mattered. "Why?" he asked. "Why would you let me come with you? You could have disappeared. No army would chase me now. I'd just be a deserter they'd forget about in a few months." "Because you saw me," Aiyana said. "Not as Apache, not as prisoner, as person. That is rare. That is worth something." They made love slowly, carefully, like two people who understood that this night might be their only night, that the world was determined to keep them apart. Afterward, they lay wrapped together, and Tom felt something he hadn't felt since childhood. Peace. Not happiness exactly, and not comfort, but peace in the knowledge that he'd finally made a choice that aligned with who he actually was, rather than who he was supposed to be. At dawn, they packed a camp. Aiyana led him north and east, through territory he didn't know, to a hidden valley where her people had a settlement. The elders regarded him with suspicion, this white man, but Aiyana spoke for him, and her word carried weight. Tom lived in that valley for 7 years. He never went back to the fort. He never regretted his choice. He learned Apache ways, not to replace who he was, but to complete him. He learned to track and hunt and read the land the way Aiyana did. He learned that honor wasn't something you could wear as a uniform. It was something you had to live every day in every choice. He and Aiyana were married in Apache tradition, and later, quietly, in a mission chapel they trusted. They had 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter. The boys had their mother's eyes and their father's stubbornness. The girl had her mother's grace and her father's conscience. 20 years later, Tom received a letter. Colonel Whitmore had died. The fort was being closed. The Apache were being relocated again, though with somewhat less brutality than before. The letter was from his sister, the only family member who'd never stopped writing him. Even when everyone else had assumed he was dead, Tom never wrote back. He was dead, in a sense, dead to the life he'd lived before, but alive in ways he'd never been when he wore the uniform. He'd freed Aiyana from her cell, but she'd freed him from his. One night had changed everything, because one night was all it had taken for both of them to understand that the price of freedom was nothing compared to the cost of staying imprisoned. Years later, when Tom's children asked him why he'd left the army, why he'd given up everything, he would tell them something his wife once said: "The soldier you were could not have become the man you needed to be. Sometimes you have to burn down your life to build something real." And Aiyana, watching him tell their children this, would smile. The smile of a woman who'd survived capture, imprisonment, and exile, and had somehow ended up with everything that mattered: